this, and a special thanks to OneKind for hosting it. We have a long-standing, very friendly cooperation with OneKind because we recognise that OneKind knows a great deal more about the situation in Scotland than we do. It's complementary. Compassion in World Farming is, as the name suggests, a global organisation. We're based in Godalming in Surrey, but we have branches across the world in America, in China, in many European countries. Our starting assumption is that cruelty to farm animals is something which disturbs people across the globe, and it is something which is best solved at a global level. And what we try to do is, in each individual country, we try to push the standards forward, and then in the other countries, we go to the government and say, you don't want to be left behind by them. Why don't you level up to their standards? And that was in many ways easier during membership of the European Union, because if you got a success, it was then instantly translated to 28 member states. That said, as non-members of the European Union, we are able to achieve progress by persuading one government or two governments rather than 28 governments. So there are pros and cons. As a charity, we have to be neutral on the issue of EU membership as we are on politics, but we try to make the best for animals regardless of what the situation is, in the same way that OneKind does. Our expert on live exports is Peter Stevenson, who's actually based in Edinburgh. He couldn't be here today, but a lot of what you see is based on his work. And what we're hoping for is that in Scotland in particular, for reasons that I'll come to, we'll make a real breakthrough this year, which will have an echo effect across Europe for reasons that I'll explain. I'm going to share the screen if that works. Let's have a look. Are you seeing a screen headed live sheep exports?
Yes, we are, Nick. That's perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. There are two main kinds of exports, which of live animals, sheep and calves. And from the UK as a whole, the largest number are actually sheep. And around 15,000 are exported from Britain to the continent every year. They go to France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. And these journeys generally last around 24 hours, 19, 27 hours. The thing about the long journeys is they are stressful. In some cases, they result in great suffering due to overcrowding, high temperatures, and animals getting injured. Because while it's possible to imagine a perfect transport where everything goes exactly right, you know, as a human traveller, that it isn't always like that, that there are delays along the way, there's problems in paperwork, and the drivers can be stuck at the border for long periods. That applies in particular in the European Union when they're exporting the animals further to the Middle East or to other countries. where the customs arrangements are not always that sophisticated, and sometimes the lorries can be stuck for a long time at the border while paperwork issues are sorted out. Now, I don't want to pick on the lorry drivers in particular. They're, you know, professionals doing their best, but normally they won't be experts in animal care. And it's understandable if in the frustrating situation when stuck at the border, not sure how long it's going to take and so on, the priority may not be to take particular care of the animals loaded on the transports. But even if everything goes well, the lengths of transport produces systematic problems. And I'll come back to that in a little bit because it relates to the court case that we're bringing. In addition, once the animals have left the UK, obviously we no longer have any kind of control over how they're treated. And there are issues there that some French abattoirs have inhumane conditions, which have been documented many times. And in addition, it is possible that the animals are re-exported to North Africa, where some of the conditions are really primitive, and we have videos showing quite extreme mistreatment of the animals. At the moment, there are no sheep exported from Scotland, but in 2016, around 2,400 were sent from Scotland to Germany and France. So there's no law saying you can't export sheep from Scotland, but it's not happening right now. Moving on to calves, the calf export is the current issue, calf export from Scotland to Spain mostly, and in some cases to Italy. And as it says on the text, the numbers are of the order of 5,000 in a typical year. They are also exported via Northern Ireland, and some English calves are added on. When they get to Spain, calves will normally be reared and fattened for later slaughter, and the conditions in Spain are, in some cases, what would be unlawful in the UK. So we are quite knowingly moving calves from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction with lower animal welfare standards. Specifically, UK law requires calves to be provided with bedding until they're 6 months old, and EU law, which applies in Spain in particular, only requires bedding for the first 2 weeks. Now, the difficulty about the transport itself is that while the animals are on the truck, it isn't practical to feed them. There are water supply tubes within the truck, so in principle they can get water, although issues can arise in case of crowding. But if you try to put milk substitutes through the water containers, it gums up the tubes, so they are unable to operate in that way, and that's not in dispute. The operators will confirm that's a problem. That's why they don't do it. For commercial reasons, they can't keep unloading the calves and feeding them separately. So they are simply not fed during the period of the transport until they've gone a substantial distance into France. Now, a calf will normally feed from its mother typically 4 times a day. The good practice in the UK is that they would be fed at least twice a day. So if they've got a long journey down to Spain with no feed at all, they are clearly suffering. Now, what the legislation says there, and it's European legislation which has been transposed into British and Scottish law, is that the water must be supplied during the journey, and food must be supplied if necessary. And that's what the current court case hinges on. The fact is that the calves will normally survive the journey, not always, but normally. So the operators will claim that food is not necessary because they send the animals, the animals arrive, they're still alive. And we argue that that is not sufficient, that the word necessary implies that normal practice should be followed, and that transporting animals for long distances without food undoubtedly causes suffering. This is intuitively clear to an awful lot of people, including most of the Scottish politicians who we've talked to. The impact of that is to damage the image of Scottish agriculture, because like the rest of Britain, it isn't really practical for British agriculture to race for the bottom and try to produce the cheapest possible products in the world. There will always be countries which can undercut us. The only way to maintain a successful market in the global context is to aim for the top, to try to be better than the others. And a lot of Scottish agriculture does attempt that. And it's frustrating for farmers who are trying to preserve high standards of welfare, high standards of hygiene, high standards in every respect, that their reputation is damaged by the very small number of farms and transporters who are engaging in this trade, which is now a very small proportion of the total Scottish agricultural industry. The importance of that is that if we succeed in persuading the court that it is not possible to transport under this legislation without providing food, then that has implications for courts right across Europe. And although a decision in the Scottish court is not legally binding in, let's say, a German court, because they're judging on exactly the same legislation, we are optimistic that a finding in the Scottish court will also be effective when we put the same case in a German court or a Polish court or a Bulgarian court. So although the trade is quite small in terms of the Scottish economy, and that's actually an argument for ending it, because the impact on the Scottish economy would be microscopic. If we succeed, then it will have a major effect across Europe. Now, we did a review 13 years ago about this. This is actually an issue which was one of the reasons why Compassionate World Farming was originally established. So it's something we've been fighting on for 50 years. The scientific evidence shows that young calves in particular are not well adapted to cope with transport because their immune systems are not fully developed and they're not able to control their body temperature well. So when you get severe heat, as in current weather, or severe cold, then they suffer additional stress. You've all seen pictures of the transports. I'm deliberately not showing you horrific pictures. Where partly I think we've all seen them, and partly this is a legal case. We're trying to win it on the facts, not just on the emotional response that you have when you see suffering, but on the fact that in our opinion, the practice is simply against the law. Now, some Scottish politicians who are reluctant to accept this have raised a number of objections which are actually misunderstanding. One of them is to say that if you have a ban on live exports, that would prevent animals being shipped from the Scottish Islands to the mainland. And that's silly because that is not an export. It is perfectly possible for a Scottish government to say we will no longer export calves abroad or other animals, and that doesn't stop transport from the islands to the mainland. There is a separate issue there that some of the long distance transport from the islands to the mainland does present challenges, but it is at least all under the same jurisdiction. So a Scottish government can say that they will try to ensure that the conditions are maintained well. In the same way, it doesn't stop animals being sent from Scotland to Northern Ireland. Again, it's the same country, it's not an export. Nor is it true, as some say, that if you have a male calf, if you're not exporting them to Spain, you've got to shoot them at birth. And that is not the case. There are around 475,000 male dairy calves born each year in Britain, and around 95,000 are in fact shot at birth each year. A very small number, as I've said, are exported to Spain and Italy, but the great majority, 374,000, are reared to enter the beef supply chain. Over half of the beef produced in Britain originates from the dairy herd. Now, only 46% of beef that's actually consumed in Britain is in steaks and roasts. A lot comes in mince and stews, and there is plenty of room in the market for meat from dairy calves. And we are only 75% self-sufficient in beef, so it makes no sense to export calves. They should be reared in the UK to high welfare standards so as to reduce our imports bill. Now, I'm leaving out here the discussion of whether we ought to be eating meat at all. Compassion addresses itself to the general population of people who either eat meat or don't eat meat, but who accept that if meat is being produced, then the animals should be treated decently. Specifically with respect to Spain, where most of the calves go, the demand is mainly for male dairy calves and weanlings, which are finished, in other words, fattened intensively for young bull production, for the domestic market, and for export to Portugal. Spain has a major business of exporting to Libya and then also to Lebanon, Turkey, and Algeria. What we don't know, and the Scottish government say they also don't know, is whether the calves which are exported to Spain are then, after fattening, re-exported to Libya and the other countries. There isn't really any dispute that the conditions for the animals re-exported to Libya in particular, but also Turkey and the Middle East, are grim. Libya is in the middle of a civil war. It is not realistic to think that they can impose high welfare standards. And even if they could, frankly, they certainly don't. So to summarize, we have a position where a very small proportion of the Scottish agricultural industry is damaging the reputation of industry, of the agriculture as a whole, causing significant suffering during the journey and potentially causing yet further suffering after re-exports. We think that it's very damaging to the reputation of Scottish agriculture, and we think, honestly, it's a scandal. We think that it should not be allowed. Now, we did an opinion poll a couple of years ago in Scotland on what voters felt about this, using Survation, one of the main opinion pollsters in Britain. We asked neutrally whether they agreed with live exports. And the large majority of supporters of all Scottish political parties oppose live exports. Interestingly, the largest proportion was actually Scottish National Party supporters, so supporters of the government. We presented those findings in Holyrood to politicians across the spectrum, and we found quite a bit of sympathy in all the parties, in Scottish Nationalists, in Labour, Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and Conservatives were restrained, let's put it this way. They didn't express a strong view one way or the other. And some Conservative spokespeople have said that they support the continuation of the trade. However, we believe that if the United Kingdom Conservative government were to press for an export ban, as they've said they may do, then we hope that Scottish Conservatives will also feel that it's something that they can accept. Certainly, it appears that if we can get this to a vote in the Scottish Parliament, that there will be a majority of MSPs who actually oppose the trade. Now, the difficulty here is that the Scottish minister responsible, Mr. Agnew, is not inclined to end the trade at the moment, and correspondingly that the government whip's not interested in bringing it forward as an issue for decision in the Parliament. The opposition parties do have the option to initiate debates, as you know, but obviously this is one issue among many, and it's a challenge to get them to use their limited allocation of days to press this particular issue, as opposed to, let's say, coronavirus or the education or policing or the other issues which are very much central to the political debate. So one of the areas, and I'll come back if I may to the things which we hope that you will do, is to press the respective parties to give this priority, because it's kind of a one-off. It's not something they have to keep raising. Once the trade is banned, we cannot imagine that it would ever be restarted. It's very marginal business, and it just needs one push. Now, moving to the specific legislation, that the specific court case that we're bringing, what we've done is we've asked for judicial review of the practice of the Scottish Government in approving live exports of unweaned calves. And our argument, as I've said, is that we believe that the requirement that the animals are fed if necessary means that in practice, with an unweaned calf, that it does need to be fed. And we know in practice that for commercial reasons, if they had to be unloaded and fed during the journey, it's very unlikely that anyone would find it profitable to do so. The initial response of the Scottish Government was to simply oppose the judicial review, as you might expect. And after we pressed the case, we were able to get the court to accept that it was an issue to be properly considered. Now, what this means is that, firstly, it's accepted that there is a reasonable case, because the court will knock out a case if they feel that it's been brought frivolously. And secondly, that Compassion in World Farming has standing to bring it. And that's traditionally a problem in courts, that because the animals can't bring the case themselves, the issue that often comes up is whether the organization, the NGO, like One Kind, like Compassion in World Farming, has got the ability to represent the animals. And this was accepted by the Scottish court. Scottish Government then attempted to delay the process indefinitely. They put a proposal to the Scottish court saying, look, you're really busy, you've got a backlog, coronavirus and everything. The Farm Animal Welfare Committee in London has recommended a ban on long-distance transport exceeding 9 hours. And the Scottish Government said, we are going to agree with this, and we will be consulting on a change to the law. So why bother with challenging the current law when we might well be changing it? Our argument on this is firstly that the possibility that you might change the regulations in the future doesn't actually mean that you can continue to break the current regulations. If the court believes that the regulations are being broken, then it isn't really an excuse to say, well, you're somewhat of a mind to consult on the possible change in the future. The court yesterday accepted our argument. So the proposed delay, which the Scottish Government asked for, has been rejected. The result of this is that the final decision on our judicial review application will be taken in October. We're expecting it to be a 2-day hearing on October 8th to 9th although the dates are remain to be finally determined. And we're optimistic that we'll win. We noticed that the decision of the court to reject the delay was taken immediately. It's quite common that the court, if they feel it's a difficult issue, they have to weigh up on the one hand, on the other hand, what the arguments are. They may ask for a few days to think it over. They didn't need a few days. They immediately said the application for delay is rejected. So we're hopeful that we're going to win. We're taking a risk here because if we lost, we would end up having to pay not only our own costs, but the costs of the Scottish Government and the costs of the Westminster Government, which bizarrely has intervened against the judicial review as well. So we're risking tens of thousands of pounds. But when people donate money to us, they expect it to be used for the animals. We think that there's a good case here, and that, as I've said, that if we succeed, it will help not only the calves in Scotland, but animals across Europe. And we believe that the similar arguments can be used for animal exports in general, live exports, and that we can expand it beyond the calf argument. One issue that you'll sometimes hear is the purpose of the export. And the animals are exported live for three reasons. One is to be slaughtered abroad, one is to be fattened and then later slaughtered, and one is to be used for breeding stock. Now, traditionally, we haven't really objected to exports for breeding because the animals are immensely valuable, much more valuable to the exporter than you or I are, and they are normally treated very carefully. The arguments that they are suffering on the route is much weaker if we're talking about a very high value animal being transported for breeding. However, what we're seeing is that some exporters are saying, well, actually, we're exporting these dozens of unweaned calves for breeding. And nobody seriously believes that. If a breeding animal is an animal who is fully grown and reared for the purpose of insemination and breeding, it is not an unweaned calf. So what we think is happening here is that they're hoping that the ban would be limited to slaughter and fattening, and that they can get around it by declaring that that the animals are only for breeding. And if we win this case, we will be asking the Scottish Government to require a plausibility test for exports labelled for breeding. So rather than simply taking the exporter's word for it, look at the animals being transported, look at the conditions in which they're being transported, and make a judgment on whether it is remotely plausible that they are being used for breeding. Now, finally, I wanted to ask you for your help. And there are three areas where each of you, if you wish, can help. First is to write to Fergus Ewing, the Scottish minister responsible, to ask him politely to stop fighting this case. Because the position now is the completely implausible one that the Scottish Government say that they accept that the recommendations of the Farm Animal Welfare Council, which would prevent these exports, should be adopted. But nevertheless, they are fighting a case which would have the effect of ending the practice. So it's a complete waste of Scottish taxpayers' money. If we win the case, as we expect to do, then our costs, as well as the government's costs, will be entirely paid by the Scottish Government. And honestly, in the current situation, is this the best way of using taxpayers' money? So we hope that you and the supporters of the organisations which you may represent will wish to write to Mr. Ewing, urging him to stop fighting the inevitable, to concede and stop piling up costs on this lost cause. Secondly, we would like to encourage you to talk with whichever political party you personally support and urge them to give this priority in the Scottish Parliament. I'm a former MP, and I know that when constituents come to me, or came to me, and said, I voted for you last time, I would hope to vote for you next time, but I really care about this issue, and I'd like you to show me that you care about it too. I found that a pretty convincing argument, and for two reasons really. People are kind of cynical about politicians, but most of us took it up because we wanted to make the world better. And if someone with a similar outlook is saying, I really care about this, I'd like you to take action, then you want to help. It's just instinctive, it's normal, it's human. In addition, if you happen to have a marginal seat, then you don't want to annoy voters. So it's not an enormously difficult demand. You're not asking them to support some incredibly unpopular cause. You can point to the opinion poll that shows that the huge majority of Scottish voters want them to do this, and ask them to just give it priority. And we're happy to provide details of the poll to anyone who would find that useful. And thirdly, of course, next spring there's going to be Scottish elections. And we would very much like it if Scottish parties included in their manifestos an end to live exports of animals, not just of unweaned calves, but of animals generally, with the argument that this is a very small proportion of Scottish agriculture, and the benefits of ending this practice in terms of raising the reputation of Scottish agriculture across Britain and in the wider world would be well worth it. I've gone on a long time and I apologise for that, but I hope you found it interesting, and I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick. That was such an informative presentation. Really enjoyed that, and so did everyone in the chat, as far as I can see. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talk about such a prevalent issue that we all really need to think more about and take action on. I'll just take some questions now. We've got some time left. So the first one is from Bernie there, and Bernie is asking, do you think it is realistic to expect the British government to ban live exports when it looks as if the British government is going to make a trade deal with America, which is going to lower animal welfare standards even more?
There's two parts to that. On the one hand, because there are no live exports to the United States, it won't, a decision on that won't get in the way of an American trade deal. And specifically, a number of senior ministers in the UK government have made personal commitments on live exports. It was one of the arguments used during the Brexit referendum by Boris Johnson and by others. And they have repeatedly said that one of the advantages of Brexit, in their view, is that it will enable them to stop live exports. So it would be extremely embarrassing for them to suddenly reverse course on that. It's possible to argue that politicians with a large majority are kind of immune to embarrassment, but normal rules of human intercourse apply, that you will normally try to avoid absolutely going back on what you said before unless there's a strong reason for it. And because the trade is fairly small for the UK as a whole, it's not an area where there's a huge economic reason to fight in the last ditch. Separately, we are very worried about the potential for concessions in the United States trade deal. And that perhaps goes beyond the discussion. I'm happy to talk about that, but the issue, the stakes there for economically are very much higher, and we're fighting a real battle there to try to make sure that any trade deal doesn't undermine the standards in Britain. I don't know whether you want to go on that, or whether you'd like to come back on that if we run out of questions on live exports. So it's up to you.
Yeah, I think we'll push on with some of the questions, if that's okay, Nick. Just now we've got a few minutes left anyway.
Sure.
So this is a nice, easy one from Jill, and Jill's asking, will the court proceedings be open to the public to attend?
Yes, I believe so. Actually, I don't know for certain, but I think it's really unlikely that they'd be held in secret. I can't see why. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. And the next one's from Stephen. And Stephen's asking, if the Westminster government has intervened against the JR, I'm afraid that should tell us a lot about its willingness to ban or at least restrict live exports going forward, i.e. it is reneging on its commitment to ban control live exports. These were largely made, in my opinion, simply because it fitted the Brexiteer narrative to ban live exports outside of the EU. What do you think about that, Nick?
We have forcefully drawn attention to the attention of the British government to the paradox that they say they want to end live exports, but they've intervened in this case. Their position is that the health authorities, which report to DEFRA in London, are responsible for implementing health controls during the transport of animals from Scotland to the continent. Therefore, the British government has an interest in the findings of the court, and they therefore felt it necessary to intervene at the start, because under court proceedings you're not allowed to jump in the middle. Unless you indicate an interest at the start, you aren't able to give evidence. So they claim that their involvement is to secure the interests of the British authorities responsible for monitoring the transport, and that they are not going to be very active in fighting the case in terms of detailed argument. Remains to be seen. I will say, in fairness to them, they did not submit evidence arguing that we didn't have a case. So the first stage, which we won, they were silent at that stage. They also didn't give evidence on the application for a delay. So we think their intervention is paradoxical and unreasonable. In fairness, I will say that so far it has been limited. We are asking Compassion Sporters in the near future to write to the UK government to ask them to either to withdraw from the case altogether or to submit no evidence against the judicial review when it's heard in October. On the more general point, was it simply a token argument made in the context of the Brexit referendum? I'd be breaching the code of neutrality that I'm required to observe from a charity if I express an opinion there. I will say that Boris Johnson's wife and father are genuine activists in the animal welfare campaign. I see no reason to believe that Ms. Johnson will renege on the commitment. I think it's not a very high priority for the UK government, but when push comes to shove, I think they will attempt to limit the scope of live exports merely to avoid an accusation of total hypocrisy. But I'm an optimist there, but we don't. You never know with these things until you've actually got them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick, for sharing that. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Take another one from Clan Campbell here, who said, Andrew Voas himself has clearly stated that breeding calves are better looked after than those unweaned calves for veal. Is that true, Nick?
Breeding calves are definitely normally better looked after because they're really valuable. It's a pure commercial thing that a calf who's destined for slaughter is in commercial terms a marginal product. An animal intended for breeding is a high welfare commodity. I don't like using the term talking about it and commodity and product, but that's the way the industry thinks, and to tackle them on their own terms, I use that terminology as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. And the next question I think we'll take is from Anne Taylor, who is asking, is it only Scotland that exports unweaned calves? Does England, and specifically Yorkshire, where I live, export unweaned or young calves?
Not at present. In the past, the transports have been topped up by English calves. There is a history here that originally, up to a year or two ago, the animals were mostly exported from Scotland via Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, and then from here down to Spain. There was an expose on BBC television of the really grim conditions under which that was happening. And P&O, who were the company involved in transport, decided to stop doing it. They felt that the commercial impact of this was so serious, and even at an individual level, the senior executives were so shocked by it that they said, we're actually, this is not our business. We're basically a transport company for people and for goods, and we really don't want to get into this. So they said, we are no longer going to work with the Scottish Government. So the effect of that has been that the transport is now suing them to the port of Ramsgate in Kent, and in a few cases to other ports, but mainly to Ramsgate. So it is possible at any time that English carbs could be added to transport, but to the best of our knowledge, that's not happening right now.
Perfect, thank you, Nick. And I think with that, we might close with one more from Nicola. And Nicola was asking, is there some written info you can direct us to on what to write to Fergus Ewing?
It will work best, honestly, if you write it in your own terms, because if everybody writes the same thing, then they'll roll their eyes and say, oh, yeah, it's some NGO churning out standard letters. If you go to Compassion in World Farming's website, you'll see a lot of material here on live exports. And if you'd like to draw on that, you're more than welcome. If you find it difficult, do drop us a note and we'll be happy to advise. But honestly, a short, simple letter will work just as well as a long letter with lots of detail, because they know the detail. And just saying you think that live exports of unweaned calves are cruel, they're damaging Scotland's reputation, and you don't want Scottish taxpayers' money used to defend the practice. That's all you need to say. And that's I think a pretty powerful argument for Scottish ministers grappling with the current economic challenges of today's society.
Yes, absolutely, Nick. Thank you so much. I think we'll finish up there. And I just want to say on behalf of all the attendees here and everyone at OneKind, thank you so much today for speaking about live exports. It was such an informative presentation, as I mentioned, and really enjoyed it. Our team really enjoyed it, and everyone in the comments has also given their thanks, saying how wonderful this presentation was, Nick. Wishing you all the best with this campaign, and OneKind as well, as you know, fully support this, and really hoping for a good response from the government soon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody who's taken the time to come to talk about this. And if you think of anything which you didn't get the chance to ask, just drop me an email. I'm on nick.palmer@ciwf.org, and just happy to respond, and looking forward to working with OneKind with the great work that you do. And thank you so much for hosting it.